Before the story begins, please drop a comment letting us know where in Canada you're watching from today. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. There are plenty more stories coming your way on Faith's story. The morning routine in our Rosedale home was something I used to look forward to. Not in a grand, sentimental way, just the quiet pleasure of a life that made sense. The espresso machine hissing in the kitchen. The smell of cedar from the backyard in early spring. Reed coming downstairs in his pressed shirt, setting a glass of orange juice beside my laptop without being asked, the way he'd done every morning for 6 years. "Don't forget you've got the Thornton meeting at 9, he'd say, straightening his collar in the reflection of the kitchen window. I built the Thornton account, I'd remind him, smiling. I think I remember. He'd laugh, that easy, familiar laugh. To everyone who knew us, we were the couple that had figured it out. I was the founder of Greystone Partners, a mid-sized development consulting firm with offices on Bay Street that I'd grown from a 3-person operation into a team of 60. Reed was our director of client relations, a position I'd created for him, genuinely, because I believed in him. I wanted us to build something together. I wanted him beside me in the work, not waiting at home wondering what I did all day. I thought that was love. Being generous with the thing you'd worked hardest for. I had no idea that generosity had a price I hadn't yet calculated. Reed noticed Amber about 3 months after she joined the firm as an executive assistant. She was 25, recently moved to Toronto from a small town in New Brunswick, the kind of person who ate lunch alone at her desks and looked faintly overwhelmed by the city. She'd made a formatting error on a proposal document her first month that cascaded into a scheduling disaster for one of our biggest clients. I heard Reed had handled it graciously, stayed late with her to fix it, walked her through the process, sent her home with a kind word instead of a written warning. I remember thinking, that's why I married him. What I didn't understand then was that something shifts in certain men when they find a woman who needs saving. Reed had always lived in my orbit, my company, my income, my contacts, my Rosedale address. He'd never said it out loud, but I could feel it sometimes. A low-grade restlessness, the way he'd go quiet when someone at a dinner party asked how we'd met, and he had to explain that I'd been his boss first. Around Amber, he didn't have to be the successful woman's husband. He got to be the hero. The changes came gradually. His phone started facing down on the dining table, instead of sitting casually between us the way it used to. He'd step out onto the back deck to take calls, and when I asked who it was, the answer was always reasonable. A client in Vancouver, a contractor running behind on a deadline. He started staying at the office too, sometimes 3 evenings a week. I didn't question it. I knew how the firm ran. I'd built the thing. But one night in February, when he came through the front door just before midnight, I reached up to hug him and caught something I couldn't explain away. It wasn't his cologne, the Tom Ford he'd worn since we started dating. It was something sweeter, younger. Drugstore vanilla, clinging to the fabric at his collar. "Whose perfume is that?" I asked, keeping my voice light. He didn't miss a beat. We were crammed in a cab with the Garfield Group people after dinner. One of the account managers was wearing something strong. He pulled off his shirt and dropped it straight into the laundry basket before I could look at it again. I let it go. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I trusted him. I was a woman who had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts and walked away from the table, having read every person in the room correctly. But at home with Reed, I switched that part of myself off. I think I wanted to. I think I decided that a good marriage was one where you didn't look too hard. The first crack I couldn't paper over came on a Thursday night in March when I was reviewing our CIBC AeroGold Visa statement. I did the household finances myself, always had. Not because Reed couldn't, but because numbers were second nature to me, and I liked to know exactly where we stood. A single charge stopped me cold. Holt Renfrew, $26,400, dated 3 weeks prior. I put my pen down and sat very still. I hadn't been to Holt's in months. I certainly hadn't spent $26,000 there. My hands were steady when I walked upstairs to where Reed was watching TV in the den. "Did you get me something at Holt Renfrew recently?" I asked, holding my phone out so he could see the statement. "It's a significant charge. I don't remember making it." The flicker across his face lasted less than a second. Then he broke into a sheepish grin and pressed his hand to his forehead like a man caught mid-surprise. He pulled me into a hug, laughing softly, explaining he'd finally tracked down the specific cashmere coat I'd admired at their Bloor Street location the previous fall. The limited edition one they'd restocked without announcement. He said he'd been holding it at the office, wrapped, waiting for our anniversary in May. It was a perfect answer. Specific enough to be believable. Sweet enough to make me feel guilty for asking. I told him he didn't have to do that. He said I deserved it. I went to sleep feeling like a suspicious, ungrateful fool. But the coat never appeared. Not in March, not in April. I checked his closet shelf, checked the locked compartment in his car when I borrowed it one weekend, checked every possible hiding spot where a gift box that size might reasonably be tucked. Nothing. I sat with that absence for a week before I did something I had never done in 6 years of marriage. I went into Reed's home office when he was in the shower, opened the second drawer of his desk, the one he usually kept locked, and found it unlatched. Beneath a folder of old contracts was a receipt from a private locksmith in Gravenhurst. Gravenhurst is the gateway to Muskoka. It sits about 3 hours north of Toronto, right at the top of the 400 at the edge of the Lake District. I'd purchased a property there 4 years ago, a 3-bedroom lake house on a private lot with a dock and a view of the water I still think about when I need to calm down. And Reed and I had spent the better part of 2 summers furnishing it together. It was supposed to be our long-term home eventually. The place we'd move when we were ready to slow down. Completely private, completely ours. The locksmith receipt was dated a Tuesday in January. A Tuesday Reed had told me he was in Ottawa for a government infrastructure briefing. I sat in his office chair for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't call him in. I took a photograph of the receipt on my phone, replaced it at the exact position I'd found it, closed the drawer, walked upstairs, and told him breakfast was ready. The performance I gave over the next 10 days was the finest work of my professional life, and I have closed some genuinely difficult deals. I waited until he was at the office before I drove up to Muskoka alone. The lake house was supposed to be empty, no tenants, no guests, just locked up for the winter with the heat on low to protect the pipes. But when I turned off the gravel driveway and pulled up to the cedar front deck, something felt immediately wrong. There were tire tracks through the snowmelt that weren't mine. The outdoor firewood rack had been used down to the last quarter. I let myself in with my key. The smell hit me first. Someone had been cooking here regularly. A plug-in diffuser on the kitchen counter was still warm, filling the air with something cheap and floral that had soaked into the curtains. A fleece blanket I had never bought was draped across my sectional. A half-finished bottle of rosé sat on the coffee table. In the master bedroom, the linen I'd left stored in vacuum bags was on the bed, rumpled, lived in, and on my nightstand sat a phone charger that wasn't mine and a tube of hand cream I'd never seen before. I opened the closet. A small rack of women's clothing occupied the space where my off-season things used to hang. Crop tops, mini dresses, going out clothes that belonged to someone who was 25 and wanted to be noticed. I photographed everything, every room, every item that wasn't mine. The rosé bottle, the charger, the unfamiliar cosmetics spread across my bathroom vanity, the tire tracks outside. I moved through that house as the way I would move through a due diligence file, systematically, without flinching, recording everything. On the drive back to Toronto, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a private electronics security firm I'd used before for corporate matters. I arranged for a GPS tracking device and a voice-activated transmitter to be installed in my Range Rover. The pearl white one Reed drove almost as often as I did. The second call was to my father, Raymond. Raymond spent 40 years building one of the largest private construction companies in Ontario before he stepped back and handed the reins to his operations team. He retired to a property in Prince Edward County, and he spends his mornings on the water and his evenings arguing about hockey. He is not a man who fusses or panics. When I told him what I'd found, there was a brief silence, and then his voice came through low and even. "Tell me what you need," he said. Over the following 2 weeks, I listened. The transmitter synced to an app on my phone, and at night, when Reed stepped out onto the back deck to take his calls, I would sit at my dressing table with a single AirPod in, and I would hear everything. The third night, I heard Amber's voice for the first time. She sounded bored, restless. She complained that she'd been stuck at the lake house all day with no car and no one to talk to, and she wanted to know when he was coming up. Reed's voice shifted into something I had never heard him use with me. Soft, deferential, almost apologetic. He called her sweetheart. He said he'd come Thursday. Then he laughed at something. A low private laugh, and he called me the warden. Like it was a nickname they'd developed together. Like it was a joke that had been running for some time. The warden. I sat very still and breathed through it. I pulled the transaction logs from our joint accounts and the visa. The $26,000 charge at Holt Renfrew was not a coat for me. There were dinners at Canoe and Alo charged on evenings Reed had told me he was entertaining Bay Street clients. A weekend at a boutique hotel in Niagara-on-the-Lake, while I'd been at a conference in Calgary. Jewelry from a goldsmith on Queen West. Skincare, great to the Muskoka address. Firewood delivery in February. He had built her a life inside mine, down to the firewood. The breaking point came on a Friday evening when I heard him, through the transmitter, promising Amber a long weekend at the lake house, just the two of them. He would tell me he had a client retreat near Kingston, take my Range Rover north on Saturday morning, and be back Monday afternoon. I called my best friend Monica that night and gave her Amber's Instagram handle. Watch it, I told her. The second she posts anything, you send it directly to me. Monica knew me well enough not to ask for more than that. I called Raymond. I told him the plan. He didn't counsel restraint. He said, I'll be at your door by 7 Saturday morning. I didn't sleep, but I wasn't spinning either. I was very, very clear. Saturday came in gray and cool the way April mornings in Ontario tend to do. Reed kissed me on the cheek at the front door, carry-on bag over one shoulder, told me he'd be back Monday and not to work too hard. I told him to drive carefully and to text me when he got there. I watched my Range Rover disappear down the street. I sat up at the kitchen table with my laptop, the tracking app open on my secondary screen, and a pot of very strong coffee. For the first 3 hours I watched the red GPS dot crawl north on the 400 through Barrie and into Cottage country. Monica sent nothing. I waited. Then her message came through. She just posted, watch this now. The video was 11 seconds long, filmed from the passenger seat of my Range Rover. Amber's hand rested on the dash. Rings I didn't recognize, nails done in a shade I'd never worn. And she panned the camera slowly across to Reed in the driver's seat, who grinned and gave the lens a little wave. The casual wave of a man who has convinced himself that consequences belong to other people. On her face she wore a pair of oversized tortoise-shell sunglasses that I had left in the center console 6 months ago, and assumed I'd misplaced. The caption, written in pink script over the video. Long weekend with my future everything. His wife has absolutely no clue we're living her best life. I read it 3 times. I downloaded the video. I captured multiple screenshots of the caption. I saved everything to an encrypted cloud folder. Then I sat at my kitchen table, looked out at the backyard where the cedar trees were coming back into bud, and felt something shift inside me into a position it had never occupied before. Not rage, though that was there underneath. Like a controlled burn behind a firebreak. Something colder. Something that felt oddly like relief. I picked up the phone and called Raymond. They're on the 400 heading north, I said. They'll be coming back Monday afternoon. I need you here. He arrived Sunday evening. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the way we'd sat across from each other through every business problem I'd brought him since I was in my 20s. Quietly, methodically, accounting for variables. Monday arrived. I dressed in black trousers and a dark jacket and felt a particular kind of calm that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with certainty. Raymond's Suburban pulled to the curb at noon. With him was Bert, his longtime operations manager, a man of few words and considerable practical experience. A second vehicle, a company truck driven by Dave, a former site foreman, idled behind. I climbed into the passenger seat, mounted my phone on the dash, and watched the red dot moving steadily south on the 400, from somewhere north of Barrie. At the speed they were traveling, they'd reach the stretch just past the Highway 89 exit in roughly 40 minutes. We drove north and found a rest stop and waited. Raymond sat with his large hands resting on his knees and said nothing. The sound was wind, through pines and the distant roar of the highway. When the dot was 6 minutes out, he looked at me. I nodded once. We pulled onto the on-ramp. The Suburban was large enough that when we slid into the lane alongside the Range Rover, there was nowhere for Reed to go. I saw the exact moment he recognized us, his head turning, his face going the color of old snow. Before he could process what was happening, Raymond's driver cut cleanly in front of the Range Rover and brought the Suburban to a controlled stop on the shoulder. Dave's truck sealed the rear bumper before Reed could reverse. 3 seconds of total stillness. Then I stepped out onto the gravel shoulder of the 400. The air smelled of cold asphalt and pine resin. Cars were slowing around us. I walked to the passenger side of my Range Rover. Through the window, Amber was pressed back in the seat, both hands raised slightly, face drained of all color. She was still wearing my sunglasses. I tried the handle. Locked. I looked at Bert. The Slim Jim was out before I finished turning my head. One clean movement and the lock released. I opened the door. Out, I said. Amber started crying immediately. The kind of crying that's a strategy, not a feeling. She said my name. She said she was sorry. She said it wasn't what it looked like, which told me she had no idea how much I actually knew and had documented over the past 2 weeks. I reached in and guided her firmly by the arm out of my vehicle. She stumbled on the shoulder gravel and sat down hard, dress riding up, sunglasses going crooked, still crying. Reed had come around to intervene and found Raymond standing directly in his path, arms folded, occupying the entire space between the two vehicles with the particular stillness of a man who has dealt with much larger problems than this one. Reed opened his mouth. Raymond looked at him. Reed went quiet. I stood in front of Amber and took out my phone and pressed record. I want anyone watching right now to pay close attention, I said. My voice was even. This woman's name is Amber. She has been living in my Muskoka lake house for the past 3 months, sleeping in my bed, wearing my things, and spending money on my CIBC visa. She posted a video from this vehicle this morning, my vehicle, calling me oblivious. I held the camera steady. The man behind me is Reed, my husband of 6 years. He works at the company I built from nothing. They are coming back right now from a long weekend at the property I purchased with my own money. I crouched slightly to hold the phone closer to Amber's face. You told your followers his wife has no clue, I said quietly. Look around. Tell me who looks clueless now. There were 8 or 9 cars stopped around us. People had stepped out of their vehicles. Phones were up. A northbound transport truck had slowed on the highway proper, the driver watching from his cab window. Someone near the guardrail started cheering. Reed tried to speak again. He said my name. He said we should handle this privately. I turned and looked at him, full eye contact. I let the silence sit until he stopped. Then I walked to the driver's side of my Range Rover, reached past the steering wheel, and retrieved my spare key from the center console where I always kept it. I walked back to where Reed was standing and held the key up between 2 fingers. I let it drop onto the gravel at his feet. My name's on the registration, I said. My name is on the insurance. Don't touch it again. I turned and walked back to Raymond's Suburban. Got in. Raymond came around the front and got in beside me. The door shut with a solid, heavy sound of something absolutely final. I did not look in the mirror. We were 15 minutes south of Barrie when I called Scotiabank's account management line. I had my account numbers memorized. I went through the verification process in a flat, clear voice and issued the instructions. Freeze all joint accounts immediately, cancel every supplementary card issued to a secondary user. Flag the AeroGold Visa and suspend all activity pending review. The representative confirmed each action in sequence. I thanked her professionally and ended the call. I called the locksmith who had done our original Rosedale install. He met me at the house before Reed could have reasonably completed whatever logistics nightmare he's managing on the shoulder of the 400. By evening, every exterior lock in the house was rekeyed. The garage entry code was changed. The security system PIN was reset to something only I knew. I spent 3 hours emptying Reed's belongings from the master bedroom. I didn't do it violently. I was careful, even. I folded his sweaters, paired his shoes, organized his suits on their hangers. Then I transferred everything into heavy-duty contractor bags and set them at the end of the driveway, outside the gate. 23 bags in total, stacked neatly by the recycling bins in the dark. He arrived at 11:30. I heard the gate intercom, then silence, then the sound of a key being tried and failing. He tried it twice more, then the rattling of the gate itself, then his phone calling mine. I watched his name light up on my screen and waited for it to stop. I went to bed. His voicemail was there in the morning. Reed standing outside in the rain that had started around midnight, asking me to open the gate, to let him explain, to please just talk to him. The voice of a man who had watched other people's lives fall apart and never once imagined his turn was possible. I deleted it and made coffee. That morning, an HR notice went out to both Reed and Amber simultaneously, signed by our head of people operations. Immediate termination for gross misconduct and conduct incompatible with continued employment. Reed received a separate notice from our firm's legal team regarding unauthorized use of corporate expense accounts and the recovery process that would follow. A week later, a process server delivered my divorce application to the address where Amber was staying, a basement unit she'd managed to sublet through a contact, in which Reed had also apparently taken up temporary residence. Monica found this out within 48 hours, because this city, enormous as it is, operates like a small town when it needs to. The prenuptial agreement Reed and I had signed 5 years ago was thorough and unambiguous. He had reviewed it with his own lawyer before signing. He had signed anyway because at the time he was confident in the permanence of our marriage and didn't intend to need it. The agreement protected everything I had owned, earned, or built prior to and during the marriage. Reed left with what he'd arrived with, a used Civic, a savings account containing $11,000, and a professional reputation that had begun circulating quietly through our industry before the divorce was even filed. The lake house in Muskoka went through a complete renovation that fall. New kitchen, new bedding, new everything that had been touched. I drove up in October when the maples were full color and spent a long weekend there alone, and by the second morning it felt entirely mine again. The water at dusk, the loons. The particular silence of that property that I had loved, from the first time I stood on the dock and decided to buy the place. Greystone Partners posted its strongest annual numbers the following year. It turned out I had considerably more focus available. Once I stopped spending energy managing the quiet anxiety of a marriage that was quietly failing. We closed a significant municipal infrastructure contract in Mississauga and expanded our team by 12 people. I took on 2 junior partners. I worked without the low hum of dread underneath everything. For a long time, I didn't ask about Reed. It wasn't avoidance. He simply didn't occupy any real space in my mind. The way you stop hearing a sound once the source of it is removed. Monica told me, about 18 months after the divorce was finalized, that she'd seen him at a mall in Etobicoke. He'd been working at a phone accessories kiosk in the concourse. He'd lost weight he didn't have to lose. His hair had grown out unevenly, the way it does when someone stops paying attention to themselves. He'd seen Monica from 30 feet away and looked away first. "And Amber?" I asked. Not from bitterness. More the way you close the last chapter of a book you've already mentally shelved. Monica said the relationship had collapsed within 4 months of the highway. The romance, apparently, did not survive the transition from my Muskoka lake house to a cramped basement unit in Etobicoke. Amber had eventually gone back to New Brunswick. She was waitressing somewhere along the Trans-Canada. Monica thought. She'd made the mistake of keeping the same Instagram account for a while, and the video of her in my Range Rover followed her everywhere, people reposting it in her comments, tagging her. She'd deactivated and reactivated twice before going fully private. The 11-sec clip still circulates periodically. I've seen it show up without looking for it. I met Grant a year after the divorce through a mutual contact at a housing policy conference in Ottawa. He was an urban planner, calm and deliberate in the particular way of people who think before they speak, and completely unbothered by the fact that my name was better known in our industry than his. We argued about a transit corridor proposal over dinner, and I liked him immediately. He asked follow-up questions instead of waiting for his turn to talk. He didn't seem to need rescuing, and he didn't look for anyone to rescue. He simply wanted a conversation with someone worth talking to. We've been together 3 years now. He moves through the Rosedale house as though he belongs there in the particular way that has nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with ease. On long weekends, we go up to Muskoka and drink coffee on the dock. While the light comes off the water, at angles I will never entirely get used to, and I think about how close I came to losing that place. Not to Reed, but to the version of myself that was willing to stop looking at things that deserved a close look. My father calls every Sunday. His voice does a particular thing when Grant's name comes up in conversation, a small upward shift that I recognize as relief. It's the sound of a man who spent a year watching his daughter be quietly diminished and is now watching her come fully back into herself. Last spring, I was asked to speak at a women's leadership event at the Fairmont Royal York. Something I've done a handful of times since the story became, as these things do, not entirely private. Somewhere in the middle of my remarks, I said something I hadn't planned to say. That the hardest part of being betrayed by someone you trusted isn't the anger, and it isn't even the grief for the relationship. It's the grief for the version of yourself that was trusting. The capable, clear-eyed, intelligent woman who walked into her own home and chose, deliberately, to stop using the skills that had built everything around her. There were women in the room who nodded before I'd finished the sentence. I don't tell them the highway story from that stage. They don't need the details of it. What they need to hear is that you can be formidably capable in every professional context and still leave that capability at the door of the wrong relationship. And that when you finally bring the same clarity home that you've always brought to your work, the results can be swift, and they can be total, and they can feel, looking back, like the most obvious thing you ever did. The Range Rover is still mine. I had it detailed the week I got it back, and I drive it every day. Reed's key is still somewhere on the gravel shoulder of the 400, in whatever condition 6 Ontario winters have left it. I don't particularly think about it. The things I spent months trying to recover, the house, the accounts, the car, the property, none of that was ever really the point. Those were the receipts, the evidence, the proof, for a court and for a public record of exactly what had happened. What I actually recovered was the part of myself that had always known better. And, finally, on a Monday afternoon on a gravel highway shoulder north of Bradford, decided to act like it. That part doesn't depreciate. Nobody else can hold the title to it, and no one, I can tell you with absolute certainty now, will ever take it from me again.